Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're connecting from. Welcome to OECD's Green Talk Live. My name is Kumi Kitamori. I'm the Deputy Director for the OECD Environment Directorate. Together with my colleagues, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's Green Talk Live webinar. And today's subject is on taming wildfires in the context of climate change. In the aftermath of yet another wildfire season, the question of whether and how we can contain such fires in the future is particularly pressing. Many of this year's wildfires occurred in the areas that are not used to them. In Canada, wildfires started especially early in the year, and to date have burned over a record-breaking 60 million hectares, almost twice the size of Portugal. Smoke from these wildfires put 1/3 of United States population, including New York City, on air pollution alert. Over the summer, the US recorded the deadliest wildfire of the century on the Hawaiian island of Maui. On the other side of the Atlantic, amidst severely dry conditions and a very hot summer, Greece has experienced the largest wildfire recorded in this century in Europe. Similarly, ferocious blazes took many lives amidst a record-breaking heat wave in Algeria. And these are just a few examples. And while we know that some ecosystems need fire to keep their ecological functions intact, extreme wildfires are pushing them towards tipping points beyond which ecosystems may be irreversibly damaged. The future will likely hold many more such extreme wildfire events as climate change plays a role in determining the frequency and intensity of such wildfires. And here our decisions matter. Increased urban sprawl has created an extensive wildland and urban interface, meaning that urban areas are increasingly mixing with wildland areas. And all this can result in devastating socioeconomic damages when wildfires do occur. So to confront these future challenges, we need to rethink our policies and practices to prevent, adapt, and to recover from wildfires. We must also recognize that fire suppression efforts are increasingly limited in their ability to fully contain wildfire losses and damages. So how are countries' policies and practices evolving in the face of this reality? And how can they scale up climate adaptation efforts and limit future wildfire losses through preventive wildfire risk reduction? So this is exactly what we aim to answer in our work on wildfire over the past 2 years at the OECD. Today, we have our colleague, Catherine Gamper. She's the team lead in the OECD Environment Directorate's Climate Change Adaptation, Mitigation, and Resilience team. And she will now present some key findings and policy recommendations from our report on this subject. We will then hear from experts from different countries with whom we have closely engaged throughout this project. And we will invite them to reflect on the report's key findings. And then after that, I will open the floor for questions from all of you online with us today. For those joining online now, you can send questions at any time throughout our talk using the Q&A function in Zoom. And then we will try to address many of them as time allows at the end of the panelists' interventions. So without further ado, now I would like to hand over Catherine Gamper, who is our team lead on adaptation work, to present the key findings. Over to you, Catherine.
Thank you so much, Kumi. Can you see my slides? Excellent. Hello, everybody from my side. As Kumi said, my name is Catherine Gamper, and I have the pleasure to present to you the findings today of the work that our team has conducted in the last 2 years, a wealth of knowledge that came together. And I have the pleasure to discuss some of these findings and the policy recommendations with our country experts here today. So thank you all for joining us. The image that you're seeing in front of you has probably passed in front of the screens of many of you. It was in New York when the Canadian wildfires actually brought the fumes down as far as New York City, but as far as Europe equally well. That was unheard of in terms of the distance such fumes have traveled due to extreme wildfires. But similar images reached us, as Kumi said, from Greece, from Hawaii, from Algeria, from Chile. I think that the list this year is very, very long. And each of these events seem to have been unprecedented events occurring in areas that did not have wildfires before at all, occurring at times of the year that haven't experienced wildfires before, and so forth. So they're all have been characterized as a new normal, perhaps, or we're asking ourselves, is this the new normal that we're seeing in those fires? If you look at Canada, for example, the fires started particularly early, and they came amidst of an unusually hot month of May, which saw 12 to 18 degrees higher than monthly average temperatures in some areas of Canada. And the drought conditions were also remarkable. Average soil moisture measures were at the levels of 10 to 15% of the averages around this time of the year in Canada. And these have been attributed to contributing to the extremity and the intensity of those wildfires. Canada is no exception. This is a trend that we're observing in wildfires in recent decades, globally, in fact. So what you can see here shows us that in Australia, since 1980, wildfire frequency, annual average frequency of wildfires has doubled since 1980 until today. In the Western United States, we see that wildfire severity, so the damages that we're observing, have increased eightfold since 1985. And if we look at global trends, which is obviously a lot coarser, shows us that the fire weather season has extended by a third since the 1980s as well. So these are trends, unfortunately, affecting us around the globe. Now, what's behind these extreme wildfires other than those conditions? And what we're observing is that there are drivers both on the human side, but also drivers in the climate system. On the human side, what has contributed to these wildfires being so extreme are unsustainable land use practices and environmental degradation, both of which have been shown to contribute to making wildfires extreme. I'm giving you a few examples here. Deforestation and peatland drainage are known to be worsening drought conditions and hence increase the flammability of the landscape. But equally, rural land abandonment, so initially rural communities were contributing importantly to maintaining the forest vegetations and keeping the forest intact. With them abandoning rural areas, vegetation is growing uncontrollably and is also contributing to making wildfires extend and increase in their intensity and severity. In addition to that, the wildland-urban interface is expanding. Here we're quoting an example from the United States, where this has increased by a third in the period of 1990 to 2010, which means people, infrastructure, and economic activities are more and more exposed to wildfires as well. Last but not least, human activity is responsible for the great majority of wildfire ignition. So there's a lot that we might be able to do to reduce fires from breaking out at the outset as well. Then there's climate drivers, and this has been much debated, but there's more and more conclusive evidence on some of the factors that we see in the climate system that is contributing to wildfire risk. Obviously, as I just gave an example of Canada, higher atmospheric temperatures, but also changing precipitation rates and wind patterns that are difficult to predict and control as wildfires are breaking out. And this, in conjunction with heat waves and drought conditions, have increased wildfire risk across the board. Climate change has doubled the total forest area burned in the Western United States, but also in Australia, we've observed from attribution science, which is helping us much understand the attributing effect of climate change, in particular climate extreme events, has shown us that the bushfires in 2019 and beginning of 2020 were 30 times more likely because of climate change. similar observation has been made in the Canadian wildfires in 2017, which are judged 7 to 11 times more likely in terms of their severity and intensity because of climate change. And the list goes on. Extreme wildfires in turn, so there's a complex interaction between climate change affecting the severity of wildfire risk, but there's also a feedback loop. Wildfires are contributing to climate change. And why? Wildfires are releasing carbon emissions in the fire because carbon emissions are stored in forests, they're stored in the soil, and as it burns, this is being released into the atmosphere. And while under normal conditions and in the long-term historical averages, this hasn't much made our carbon net balance move, the recent extreme fires did make them move. So if you look at the bushfires in Australia, the carbon balance in that year in Australia was 8 times higher than in an average wildfire season. And this in turn obviously increases climate change, which in turn then increases wildfire risk as well. So this is a vicious cycle that is very, very challenging to get out of. In terms of the impacts, while we don't have comprehensive global assessments yet, there's pretty good assessments coming out of individual wildfires. And here we've categorized them into 3 big categories in terms of ecosystems, human health, and impacts, as well as economic impacts. In terms of ecosystems, there's obviously negative impacts of extreme fires. So we know that to some extent, fires and wildfires are actually good for ecosystem health. But when they become extreme, even ecosystems reach a certain tipping point beyond which they're they receive irreparable damage. And this is something we've observed, for example, in Australia, where 3 billion animals have been killed or displaced and because of their habitats being destroyed during the bushfires. In terms of human health, one of the most underestimated impacts is in fact the long-term health consequences in terms of respiratory problems. So the long-term mortality or the medium to long-term mortality after fires is incredibly high and estimated to be at around 340,000 deaths annually across the globe. Also, the economic damages, which in comparison to other climate extreme events such as floods or storms, have been relatively contained, let's say, before the last 10 years. And now we're seeing an increased number of events in which these have exploded. And one of these examples are the campfires in California that produced some $20 billion in damages. We are observing similar numbers for the bushfires in 2019 and 20 in Australia. These are remarkable damages if you compare them with the floods, which have been deemed incredibly high in Germany, in the Ahr Valley. This is comparable in terms of the scale of economic damages and disruptions. Now, how have countries reacted? A lot of the countries have reacted by saying we need to scale up our fire suppression equipment. We need to scale up our capacity to extinguish these fires. And here you see the numbers in the United States. In the 1980s, in the United States, we spend around $100 million a year to contain or to suppress fires. Now this has grown to above $4 billion in annual averages in the last few years. Yet we know that fire suppression has been becoming increasingly ineffective in containing fires. We cannot extinguish them, but even in containing them. So that means avoiding them spreading into areas where we really do not want them to go, because they create human and economic damages. And it has been shown that it's harder and harder to contain fires from these kind of damages, which sparked us to think that a paradigm shift in wildfire management is really necessary. We need to do more before wildfires occur to avoid these damages, both to ecosystems, but also to human systems. And this is where our work comes in, that we've done with the countries in the last 2 to 3 years, where we looked really into what can be done before wildfires occur to lessen the extent of their damages. And one that comes to mind is ecosystems. We need to protect ecosystems and keep them resilient so that wildfires, when once they occur, they have less potential to spread. That means, for example, we maintain forests and peatlands from illegal activity and unsustainable use. We restore degraded ecosystem. That means We manage tree diversity. We re-wet peatlets because we all know that these are factors that are decreasing the risk of drought, and hence they are increasing our resilience to the spread of fires. And in all of that, as you know, forests aren't just owned by the magic government hand, but they're also owned by a large part of it in a lot of countries by private landowners. So it means monitoring and enforcement is key so that these measures are actually taken also in land that is not so easily controlled. Then what we need to do is we need to better manage the wild and urban interface. And there are measures that we can take, for example, by prescribing fires, by setting fires in a controlled way early in the season, so that once fires ignite, they have less fuel to actually spread. We can create buffer zones, as you can see here, but also fuel breaks that stop the fire from coming too close to the interface areas where we do not want them to go. And then we need to engage private landowners to encourage them to engage in active land management measures around their own houses. And I'll get into what these measures can be now right away. How can we adapt land use and building codes to wildfires? We need to adapt them. We need to integrate what we know from wildfire hazard models and climate risk assessment into how we do land zoning and and so as to inhibit the permission of developing land in areas that are of high risk of wildfires. Building codes too need to be adapted regularly so as to mandate the use of non-flammable materials in areas that are of risk of wildfires, but also to incentivize the use of structural protection measures, which can hugely limit the damage to physical assets. The same goes for infrastructure operators and the measures they need to adopt. Then we need to increase, and this is really something we observe across all OECD countries, the difficulties of getting climate scientists to talk to wildfire hazard modelers. Those two need to speak to each other, those communities, so that we understand the future hazards of wildfires. And this can only be done on the basis of incorporating climate models and climate projections. Yet this interface we see barely connected, and those downscaled models of how climate is expected to attribute to and contribute to expected future hazards is rarely done in practice across OECD countries. Then it's a governance issue. It's not just the responsibility of environment ministries. It's not just the responsibility of civil protection agencies. It's a responsibility across the board by those that are planning, by those that are managing and operating infrastructure. It's a responsibility that needs to be integrated and incorporated at national and subnational levels across all levels of government. Then funding, and I hope to hear about this from our countries here with us today. Funding is an issue. We need to close the funding gap, and we need to make sure that there is funding available for these prevention measures that we know that we can take. That means not just public funding, but we need to incentivize these private investments in those measures as well. And we need to continue trying to secure affordable insurance, which, as many of you know, has become less and less available across OECD countries. And in the end, ends up being contingent liabilities in terms of the losses and damages subsumed by all other actors. And with that, I think I gave a very quick overview of our report. For those of you interested in looking into all of this in more detail, don't hesitate to access the report. We'll pull this up at the end of our presentations as well. Back to you, Koen.
Great. Thank you so much, Catherine, for all that. Just a quick question. You mentioned that it's human drivers that are contributing to the extreme wildfire, as both the population, the number of people, and the assets increasing the areas that you call the wildland urban interface areas. You also said that there are tools or approaches to contain wildfire risks in these areas. And there were some examples there, buffer zones and fuel breaks, etc. So when we know some of the things to do, what are the barriers to implementing these measures and policies?
Yeah, thanks for this question. I'd be curious to hear what our country experts are thinking. From our observations, what is incredibly difficult is that rezoning in itself is difficult. zones that have been established decades ago, and telling landowners today that they're going to be devalued because they're deemed as high-risk zones is as such not an easy thing to do. Resettling people, which is the ultimate measure that we can take to protect assets as well as communities, it has proven very difficult to do, not just for wildfires, but for all kinds of climate risks. And the good practice examples we're observing there are those that actually try to maintain community coherence, which means you don't settle people in all kinds of places, but you actually try to resettle entire communities. That in itself is a mammoth task that can take decades to actually implement. And then what we found is funding to be a key issue. So if you tell people that have built their houses under perfectly legal conditions decades ago in an area that at the time was free of wildfires, actually making them pay for protection measures, costly protection measures, and buying costly insurance today is a question of equity as well. You know, it's the climate change is, as we all know, is a global problem, and the impacts of which are suffered locally. So there's huge equity questions that arise as well. Again, going back to the role of government and making sure that we take care of these distributional impacts of wildfires as well.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks so much, Catherine. Now, I would like to give the floor to another expert from the US, Madeleine Rubenstein, who is the National Science Lead for the United States Geological Survey's National Climate Adaptation Science Center. So Madeleine, in the last 3 decades, climate change is estimated to have doubled the forest area burnt in the Western United States. And wildfire severity increased 8-fold between 1985 and 2017 across Western forest. Meanwhile, infrastructure damage caused by wildfire in the same area increased by nearly 250% in the past 20 years. So these are some staggering numbers. How has climate change influenced wildfire risks assessments in the United States, in your country? How is the US adjusting its policies and practices to these very extremes that we are seeing? Over to you, Madeleine.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you for the excellent question, and also just for the opportunity to participate in this webinar. I know that the United States is very grateful to the OECD for its work on this topic, and particularly to have had the opportunity to contribute to the report as a case study. I know it was a really great opportunity to take a step back and do some of this thinking about how we're addressing wildfire in the context of climate change. So I'll tackle those two parts of your question separately. First, thinking about how can we kind of conceive of wildfire risk assessment in the context of climate change? So, as Catherine mentioned, thinking about accurate risk assessments is really critical to wildfire management in the US and broadly. We really can't think about effectively addressing wildfire risk without having a comprehensive and accurate understanding about how risk is distributed across the landscape. So we know that climate change is altering where and when wildfire risk is distributed across the landscape. So there's that spatial element. We're thinking of areas that have never before experienced extreme fire that are suddenly seeing an increase in that fire risk. And fire-adapted ecosystems, which are used to wildfires, are, of course, experiencing repeated burns at frequencies and intensities that really strain their capacity to adapt. So that spatial element is changing. We also then, of course, have the temporal element that's changing as well. So we need to think about how wildfire risk is dynamic across time, thinking about longer wildfire seasons that are starting earlier, ending later, and altered return intervals. So we're seeing that increased frequency in some areas. So adapting to these changes in wildfire risk and having updated assessments that really reflect that changing risk is really challenging. I think it is worth taking a moment to just think about the different sources of uncertainty that render those risk assessments challenging in this context. So we have uncertainty about climate change itself, both the emission scenarios and how we expect the climate system to adapt to that. There's uncertainty in that element. We have uncertainty about our own land use patterns and practices, thinking into the future. As Catherine mentioned, some of these questions about zoning, where we expect building to occur, there's uncertainty in that element. And then, of course, we have uncertainty about how the ecosystem will respond. And all three of those elements are really important as we think about coming up with accurate projections about what wildfire risk is going to look like in the future. So it's just an important element to keep in mind. So in the United States, we think about wildfire risk assessment as being fed by a few key information types: weather conditions on shorter timescales, vegetation and land cover types on slightly longer timescales, and then historical information on where we saw past wildfire hazard information. Of course, if we were living in a static system, that past wildfire information would be a perfect predictor of the future, but we know it's not, and that's really our key challenge here. So in the United States, primary sources for wildfire risk assessment are really spread across multiple agencies. We don't have one centralized sort of Ministry of the Environment, so that does pose some information challenges. So it's spread across multiple federal agencies, that's at our national scale, and multiple sub-national agencies at different states. So some examples. The U.S. Geological Survey, which of course is the earth science agency for the Department of the Interior, we have a fire hazard map that's linked to weather monitoring data. And so that's updated really frequently to really focus on short-term wildfire hazard information. Alternately, we can think about the wildfire hazard potential map. So this is managed by the U.S. Forest Service. And that's something that's updated annually to think about those changes that occur on much longer timescales. So thinking about land management planners and trying to give them a tool to inform fuel reduction measures, for example. A few other key resources when we think about wildfire risk assessment in the United States include the National Interagency Fire Center. So they provide data on ignition sources of past events and what the associated suppression strategies were. And the FEMA's national, so that's our Federal Emergency Management Center, they provide information on National Risk Index, which incorporates information on social vulnerability, so sort of people who are there. Because, of course, when we think about risk, it's not just the hazard itself, but also the consequences of those hazards. So really, to get at your question, how do we think about incorporating climate change information into those risk projections? So the answer to that is sort of complicated in the sense that, we can point to a lot of excellent research that's been done thinking about incorporating climate change information into wildfire, our estimates of wildfire severity, extent, and intensity in the United States. So there is a pretty solid scientific foundation for that. But there is still a lot of additional work to do to really integrate that at an operational scale for managers in terms of producing really accurate wildfire risk assessments, particularly in the future. So currently, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, NCAR, is conducting research on integrating projections of climate change into wildfire hazard modeling through its Community Earth system. The most recently published National Climate Assessment, so that was the 4th National Climate Assessment, included projections of future wildfire risk under different climate scenarios, but it's important to note that that really wasn't intended for kind of operational use by managers, so that was at a much kind of broader scale. And then the U.S. Geological Survey, which I represent, is also currently conducting research on how intentional burning practices, so this includes not just prescribed burning, but also cultural burning by indigenous groups, how that might be, how we might think about how climate change is affecting some of those intentional uses of fire and thinking about altering, prescribed burn windows, for example. But putting that all together, we really still do have a lot of work to do to think about how we can incorporate climate change into our standard hazard and risk assessments. And then thinking about the second part of your question, what should we think about as we're actually trying to adapt, our policies and practices to these new conditions? There are several kind of main areas that we think about. First of all, forest and fuel management. And then prevention measures such as land use regulations and building codes and standards. So in terms of fuel management, fuel and forest management is really a key tool in the United States for wildfire prevention, as it is in many countries. So the U.S. Federal Wildfire Risk Management Strategy cites vegetation and fuel management as one of our key priorities. So an example of that is the U.S. Forest Service, which is set to treat an additional 20 million acres across national territory, and then to support the treatment of an additional 30 million acres across other federal, state, and tribal lands. This includes both prescribed burning, but also vegetation thinning. And it's important to note here the ways in which, we are increasingly trying to think about how traditional ecological knowledge of indigenous communities really can be incorporated as a way to think about enhancing forest management practices, policies, and practices. And we do have established federal tribal partnerships in indigenous uses of wildfire and ecosystem management to help improve ecosystem health. Zoning, as we discussed earlier, there is, of course, an increased use of zoning and land use planning requirements to think about reducing risk. We see examples of this in California, where new development in high-risk areas must adhere to strict building, permitting, and zoning requirements. But as Catherine mentioned, there really are challenges to this. It's very complicated to rezone new development, but even more complicated to think about, rezoning existing development. Building codes are a really important tool that we're thinking about to reduce wildfire risk. So for areas where building is going to continue or where it already is, areas like California have, put in increasingly strict standards about fire hardened structures and compliance reviews to help make sure that these building practices are going into place. And then finally, thinking about emergency preparedness. So we're trying to think increasingly about the appreciation of uncertainty and risk associated with wildfire in multiple spheres. So, really related to fire, we're thinking about the latest risk management protocols issued by the National Interagency Fire Center that are aiming to provide guidance to coordinate emergency management services. So that's work really focused on fire. But then, even more broadly, so thinking again about those Canadian wildfires, this summer that had a massive impact on air quality. I think we are having a broader conception of what emergency preparedness means in the context of these mega wildfires. I know for myself, living outside of DC, that really was a wake-up call, for myself and my family, that this really is affecting people at a personal level, even when the wildfires are quite a ways away. So with that, just considering this all together, it's really work like this report and the analysis that's being conducted by the OECD that's helping us to think about putting into place these better practices. There's clearly still significant work to do in the United States to help advance how well we're thinking about climate change impacts in the wildfire sphere. But I really look forward to hearing from other countries and continuing to share our experiences. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Madeleine, for sharing the U.S. experience and perspective. And now we would like to turn to Australia. By the way, there's for audience with questions, please do use the Q&A function, because hopefully we can come back and take some of those. So now I'm happy to introduce Raul Hawad. He's the Director for Nature, Partnerships and International Section at the Australian National Emergency Management Agency. So, Raul, from the experience in your country with Black Summer bushfires back in 2019 and 2020, but also other fires before and since then, what are the challenges to limiting these types of extreme wildfires through preventive measures? How can Australia, in your view, further improve its resilience building approaches, if you will? Over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Kumi. And also, I'd also like to echo my sincere thanks to the OECD. It's been a great project that we've been involved with. And also like to highlight the excellence and the amazing subject matter expertise that we've got with the panel here today. Hopefully I could do some justice as well and do a bit of value add too. But to the questions that you've asked, Kumi, there's a few different reflections. It was very good hearing Catherine's highlights from the OECD report. So I might just focus on a handful of the issues that we've seen, which I think resonate with a number of OECD countries in particular. So with the drying climate and climate change in Australia more generally, and was highlighted in Catherine's presentation, we are seeing much longer fire seasons. So on average, over the last 4 decades, we've seen the extension of our fire season in terms of the number of days where there's a higher than the normal risk to wildfires, an extension of around about 27 days. So effectively an extra month worth of fire season preparedness. So like from 2019, 2020, when we experienced the bushfires, that was way sooner than we had expected. But also on the flip side of it, from a disaster management side, we're also seeing, while there's going to be a reduced or an expected reduction rather in terms of rainfall, we are thinking that there's going to be more intense periods of heavy rain. So what we are expecting in the future would be more concurrent events happening in Australia. And Australia is already a large country, but it means that it's not that uncommon as it is at the moment to be experiencing fires in one area and floods in another area. So the whole concept of concurrent disasters, as well as the cascading effects that we are seeing with disaster. So for example, I know this is not wildfire related, but the flooding events that happened in Australia last year was I guess phenomenal in terms of different areas of our coastline just being hit by flood after flood. but it has just meant that it's a much more challenging thing from a perspective of capacity and even capability. Australia's particular challenge in this space is because of the fact that most of our emergency services sector is actually staffed by volunteers. And so actually being able to ensure that those volunteers have got the resources, but also have backup, I guess, as we look at changing demography over the next few decades, will also be a particular challenge for Australia as well. Also, to some of the other points that Catherine had mentioned, definitely the urban environment and the change in the way in which we are living in Australia. Certainly with COVID as well, it changed where people were living. A lot of people moved out of the major cities and into more rural and remote areas, has meant that there are those increased pressures now. From the perspective of even doing preventative measures when basically people are living in areas where forests have grown up around them, essentially. And one of the other points that I wanted to highlight as well was just around governance responsibility and the concept of shared responsibility as well when it comes to disaster management too. So Australia has a federated model, which means that at the Commonwealth level, we have quite limited powers when it comes to disaster management. Most of these are typically delegated to states and territories, and they may delegate further downwards to local government. And what that means is that at least during the 2019-2020 bushfires, there was some confusion in terms of where the lines of responsibilities would be for different levels of government. So a lot more clarity in terms of the roles for the different levels of government needs to be taken on board. And further to one of the points that Catherine had mentioned there as well, when you're talking about land management practices, especially when you're talking about preventative wildfire burning, you do need to bring in a lot more players. There's a lot more stakeholders, especially at the local government level, where you're frequently dealing with personal and private owners of land, but also different ministries and different local governments as well. So there is a bit more of a challenge there in terms of ensuring that everyone is brought to the table to actually support that. But in terms of what we can do in terms of building Australia's resilience, so a lot of the same points that Madeline has mentioned in her presentation there are a lot of areas that we can actually look at trying to strengthen our capability. I think certainly understanding disaster risk is one of those key priorities for us. We do have a national disaster risk reduction framework and just recently released a second national action plan for implementing that framework. And they do pick up on things that we had noted during our midterm review of the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, highlighting the fact that we do need to do a lot more with the information that we have, not just in terms of making sure that we're helping policymakers as well as emergency management stakeholders actually understand and make better decisions, but also in terms of getting that information out to the public as well when it comes to a disaster that might be incoming. To go into that into a little bit more detail, we have been investing a lot more in terms of some of the capabilities within the Australian system as well. So at least at the Commonwealth level, we have a couple of different facilities, including the National Situation Room, as well as our National Joint Common Operating Picture as well. And the intent is with these particular facilities is that they provide near real-time information and are used to inform states and territories as well as emergency management stakeholders in the lead up to a disaster, or also just to support them during a disaster event itself. We also manage higher risk weather season briefings as well, which are provided direct to emergency management stakeholders. We're about to actually hit one of those in the next couple of weeks as well, because we are about to move into Australia's fire season. And then also there's a lot of work with the community and also with private sectors as well. And that kind of gets to the point of this concept of a shared responsibility. So we do accept that governments do have a very significant role when it comes to disaster management, but it's one of those things that we do need to have a greater awareness at all levels of society as well. Community organisations play a big role, and particularly in the Australian sector when you consider that so many of our emergency service workers are actually volunteers. But it's also pertinent for us to bring in community sector representatives as well, just to ensure that we've got an inclusive approach when it comes to disaster management, and also to ensure that we can draw upon things like First Nations approaches and cultural practices when it comes to preventative fire burning. So look, I could go into a little bit more detail. Oh, I will wait one more point, and also investing in disaster risk reduction is also a big thing too. So the thing that we do have in Australia, which was recently launched, was a disaster ready fund, and I would acknowledge that this is a Commonwealth fund, so there are activities that are happening at local and at state and territory level governments. But the Disaster Ready Fund effectively works with states and territories to help them invest in activities which focus around disaster risk reduction as well as build resilience over the longer term. So it's a $1 billion fund over the next 5 years. And this is the first cycle, the first round of actual projects. We had 180 projects, or over 180 projects successful in that process, and around about 20 of them were very much focused on wildfire reduction and wildfire activities as well. So I might just pause there. I look forward to the further comments that we'll get and questions as well from the audience today. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Al, for sharing your insights from Australia. So now we turn to another part of the world. So we have now João Verde. I hope I'm saying your name right. He's the head of integrated management policies from Portugal's Agents for Integrated Rural Fire Management. So following the devastating 2017 wildfires, Portugal made some key efforts to improve wildfire management. And your country introduced several far-reaching policy and institutional reforms, and then enhanced this balance between emergency response measures and long-term fire prevention and climate change adaptation. So, João, how do you see, or what do you see as the key elements and achievement in this reform process that your country went through, and what challenges still remain going forward? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Kumi. It's a pleasure to address you all today. Let me just add, Raul, even in Portugal, we can have floods and fires, let alone in Australia. Yeah. So I would say one of the key elements to our policy transformation was not hiding behind climate. We just knew we had to act. We do know that our context is one of uncertainty. We are bound to be somewhat surprised by days of prolonged heat and dryness, and we must adapt for that, but not necessarily with more equipment, mind you. So we had to look at what had happened and understand what was needed. And one of the key things we needed was to break silos, definitely, because we do know that organizations do the best they can, for sure, within their set of responsibilities. But we wonder if dialogue with other organizations, as well as sharing data or best practices, is always the best there can be. One other key aspect and change that we went through is management, because we all know that people will take better care of the land they get value from. So abandoned territories, or those from which people have a hard time getting money from, are very less likely to be adequately managed. And management is absolutely key, because a well-managed land will withstand fire far better regardless of land cover. So we also focused on that deeply. Another key element for us in policymaking was and is expertise and qualification. Our landscapes, or in our landscapes, I would say, fires demand two major areas of expertise. One of them is protecting people and their belongings, and the other is reducing impacts on landscape and adequately managing fire suppression within the forested areas. So it's not clear for us that people taking care of one of the aspects are also able to perform the other adequately. So expertise is paramount, and making sure that the right people are tasked on the right functions is also key. Just as is, or even perhaps more than the others, governance. And I saved the governance for last in this few set of keys, because governance ties this all together. We know we needed different institutional arrangements to foster dialogue and to bridge the gaps that we know understood that existed. And that is why Portugal has opted into a facilitating agency dedicated to integrated wildfire management. And we are tasked with many things, but among them is the coordination of the new integrated fire management system. We created governance bodies from the national level all the way up. I'm not mistaken when I say all the way up to the local level, Portugal brought together within the system more organizations that could help each other with what they have best, creating spaces for them to think and to plan initiatives at their own levels, according to the national strategy, sure, but also regarding their own priorities. Our system is therefore now one of permanent monitoring and far better accountability. There's a more balanced focus and investment on both prevention and suppression, even though that's, of course, a work in progress because it's a fairly new system. But you also asked about challenges. So we must all understand the need for change. You see, no reform will be entirely successful unless everybody agrees there is a need for change. And if we just look at climate change as a catastrophe about which we can do little, we might be left with the impression that everything we do is right and that there's some act of God or of nature that ultimately creates uncertainty we work in and about which we can do nothing. Well, if that happens, people will believe they did everything they could. Nature was just overwhelming, which might be the case sometimes, but we have to look within our own processes of work and find points for improvement. And that's one of the things that challenges and that we are currently doing. But change also requires funding. Catherine was speaking about funding. Everybody speaks about funding. We know societies have a lot of challenges. Finding money to tackle them all is extremely difficult. Therefore, it remains a very good challenge to make sure that every single euro is well spent. It might be the case of not having more, but spending better what there is. On all steps of the wildfire value chain, which is wider than just prevention and suppression. And since we know most fires are of human origin, we must also understand that apart from a few futile reasons, fire happens because someone has a need for it. So we should offer alternatives or work closely with people that actually want to burn, as long as burning is a viable option, of course. Stakeholder engagement is challenging, but it's a highly rewarding challenge. Finally, at least for now, we look at international dialogue and we find the need for a common framework, one of the key challenges to tackle. We have worked on an international framework, actually together with OECD, and we truly believe that sharing common principles, goals, and standards would go far, far in having better protected wildfire landscapes and societies. So with this, back to you, Kumi. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Joe. Very interesting, three very specific country perspectives. We actually have quite a lot of questions from the floor, and we may only have time to take a couple of them, but let's turn to them, and my colleagues have been feeding the questions. So the first one is to Joao, to you. There's a question from the room on what kind of global or a regional response must exist to fix these issues that we've been talking about. We know that Portugal is spearheading an effort in that direction through an international framework on wildfire management. Could you quickly take this question? And then we have another one after that to Madeleine. But over to you, Joe, first.
Yeah, sure. That ties in with my last statement. We do need an international framework. If we all agree on standards of operation and on common principles, cooperation is far simpler. We get to exchange resources, we get to exchange expertise and best practices. So we should be looking, when I was talking about silos, silos exist not only domestically, but also internationally. So we just should skip borders because wildfires actually know no borders. They just spread. So we have to share data, share expertise, have common principles, common goals, somewhat of a common set of ideas so that we can cooperate far closer. That's, I'd say, in a nutshell, my idea on this.
Okay, thank you very much. We can take, let's take another question. And this one was, it's addressed to Madeleine. You mentioned fuel breaks in your talk and buffer zones. We received some questions and they're interested to hear a little bit further in terms of examples of this. Can you elaborate on that? That's on fuel breaks and buffer zone.
Yeah, that's a great question. So that really falls under the overall heading of kind of fuel management and forest management. Although of course I will point out that we're interested here in wildfires broadly. So that includes not just forest management, but also, grass fires and other types of ecosystems like we've seen recently. So in that general heading of sort of fuel management, there are a couple different approaches. One is thinning, so trying to reduce the overall fuel load within an ecosystem. So that could look like within a forest, trying to reduce some of that undergrowth and make sure that there's essentially less fuel overall. We can think about ecosystem management. So that's trying to think about the types of vegetation that's growing in an environment. So we know, for example, like in Hawaii, there are a lot of invasive grasses that are much more prone to fire than the surrounding vegetation. So that's a different type of intervention. Prescribed burning. So rather than thinning or intentionally removing vegetation, we can think about actually setting controlled fires under particular conditions and trying to reduce the fuel that way. And then fire breaks and buffers. So that is the sort of particular way in which you're focusing either thinning or through either thinning or burning or other kind of mechanical means, actually really reducing or eliminating to almost zero the fuel load in a very strategic location, so that you're sort of trying to stop a fire from spreading to a different way. So we can sort of think about that in an overall umbrella or maybe like a tool kit of different tools that we have available to try and all reach that same goal, which is reducing overall fuel loads within the area. Some of those approaches are really focused on kind of a much broader, wider area where you're trying to reduce fuel loads across an ecosystem. Other, like fuel breaks and buffers, you might really be using that strategically to protect a particular asset. So they sort of have slightly different goals, but overall the same general idea. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for these further examples. We have another one in, this one to Raul. So the question is, the natural regeneration of fires that was organized in traditional cultures in the past, is it still, there's still a role for this to organize in a managed way? Maybe, you touched on this a little bit. Maybe you can elaborate further on this question?
Yeah, definitely. Look, I think that there's been this long observation, at least it's increasing also in terms of predominance around cultural practices when it comes to fire management or vegetation management. And particularly this is the case in more rural and remote regions in Australia as well. So there have been a number of initiatives where we have been trying to engage with local Indigenous communities in terms of land management practices too. Australia's challenge, I think, as well here is when you consider our forestry types. So yes, we do produce a lot of timber from the perspective of an agricultural and production perspective, but a lot of our native occurring vegetation is eucalypts and acacias, which are timbers which burn at very, very high and very, very easy temperatures to burn at as well. So fire has always played a role in terms of those particular plants releasing seeds and actually part of that process as well. And so that's the reason why I think that this observation of cultural practices existing for a long period of time and also observing some of the changing seasons coming up as well has informed some of the ways in which we're wanting to address the situation. Doesn't apply in every situation, I will acknowledge, because of the fact that we are building out into more of these areas now. So we do need to leverage that, but also take on board other new and innovative features as well, whether it's using fire breaks, as Madeline has mentioned there, create buffer zones when using cultural practices, or also just looking into better disaster risk assessments as well in those regions. Thanks.
And if I can, I think it's just,
go ahead.
I'd love to just highlight, really emphasizing what my colleague from Australia brought up, which is that in the United States, this is also a really important topic that's gaining a lot of increasing attention, both from the management community, but also really the research community, both ecological researchers and social science researchers, just recognizing to the extent to which, we've really had sort of blinders on with this idea of there's sort of the natural system, managers come in, we use fire to cut fuel loads, and that's the end of the story. And that's just simply not true. We have, Indigenous communities and tribes in the United States that have been using these practices for, time immemorial. And not just as a way to kind of reap some benefit from the landscape, like reducing fire intervals, but also a really dynamic relationship between people and the landscape. So this is to, these are for cultural and religious practices. This is also for things like supporting fire obligate species that actually require fire and are really important for the health of both people and the landscape. So I think that really increasing recognition of like fire is an important tool, both culturally, ecologically, socially, that we can really be learning a lot from that, and also in a respectful way, ensuring that can continue to happen is a real area, I think, of progress and increasing attention in the United States. Just wanted to bring that forward.
Yeah, no, great, thanks. So we need, both the traditional and also some new innovative approaches. We need all decks on all, what do we say? Hands on
all hands on deck.
All decks, all hands. Yeah, whatever. We need to be pressing all buttons, multi-pronged approach, whatever the term is. But yeah, we need to be attacking from all fronts. We have one more question. I hope, I'm looking at time. I think we can squeeze in one more. And we have a question on insurance. Maybe I'll turn to Catherine, if that's okay. So the question is, I'm squinting. What is, oh yeah, okay. So we hear about insurance companies pulling out of, providing fire insurance against fire in some areas. And what can be done about it, or what's being done about it in areas where we are seeing this? Catherine, do you want to take that?
Yeah, with pleasure. Thanks, Kumi. I'll be fast on that one. And there's other experts in the room and our country experts. Please feel free to react as well. We know from insurance economics that insurance for climate extreme events and other non-climate related disasters work, but in theory, where the probability is high, but the expected damages are low. So if we're confronted with a sort of what initially we had deemed as low probability, high damage events, and they then occur repeatedly, well, theory predicted that this was not going to be insurable, and that insurance companies, if they were to stay afloat, simply cannot. Now, there's countries that introduced a long time ago obligatory insurance mechanisms, such as France. That means that every household is contributing, and that way we avoid having skyrocketing insurance premia for those that actually live in hazard-prone areas. Which from a sort of a distributional perspective is a very nice idea. But from what we observe from our OECD analysis is that even those mechanisms are starting to struggle. So in France, the CatNat mechanism has been falling back into the state guarantee in the last, I think, 4 to 5 years consecutively so. And the long-term viability of even a state-backed up insurance instrument is put into question. Then there are calls for insurance companies to actually then be our interlocutors for enforcing private prevention measures, the installment of private prevention measures, which is all nice and good, but it means there's a double expectation we have from insurance to lower the contingent liabilities for the state and help the state actually enforce private protection measures against wildfire risks, which I think is too asking much to insurance providers, and hence we see them pulling out from the market. So if we want those instruments to continue being part of our funding mix for all kinds of wildfires, then I think we need to rethink the enabling environment of making this market functioning and sustaining.
Do other panelists want to come in on this? And if not, well, it's time, but maybe we can squeeze in one more question if audience and the panelists are okay with that. So this is a very interesting one. Let's see, my eyesight is failing me, but okay. So this is about power companies, electric utilities. So maybe for João from Portugal, maybe you want to take that. So apart from, so we know about Australia and North America, apart from these two contexts, what kind of cooperation do we see or is happening in terms of power utilities to reduce wildfire risks? So this is to João.
Yeah, sure. It's a very close cooperation. Power companies in Portugal are deeply invested in managing fuels, So they take care, I'd say, quite well managing fuels in the vicinities of their power lines and other structures, because they actually understand the problems that wildfires will pose them. And they also understand the impacts that their own structures could have if they would create wildfires. So I would say they are deeply interested in the matter. They go to great lengths to manage fuel around their own structures. So it's I'd say not much of a problem there, at least for us.
Yeah. Okay, good to hear. Thank you. And then I think we are coming to the end of the Green Talk webinar at the OECD. So thank you very much to Madeline Rubinstein from the United States, Joan Verde from Portugal, and Raul Ravat from Australia. It's really nice to have all these different country experts to bring their perspectives to contribute to this exchange of experiences. And thank you very much to the audience for your active participation through these excellent questions we had. So now it's very clear that there's much left to be done. And then we are at OECD, we're looking forward to continuing this conversation with our experts from different countries, maybe going forward additional countries and wider stakeholders. And for those of you who are interested in this report that we presented at the beginning, please don't hesitate to visit our website, and maybe colleagues can put up the information again on the screen as we close. And thank you again for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing some of you, many of you, in future Green Talk events. So have a good day. Thank you. Bye.